That I was right out of my head. He said I need treatment, but I'm not that easily led. He said I was the type that was most inclined, when out of his sight, to be out of my mind. And he thought I was nuts. No more ifs or ands or buts. They say as a child I appeared a little bit wild with all my crazy ideas, but I knew what was happening. I knew I was a genius. What's so strange when you know that you're a wizard at 3? I knew that this was meant to be.
Personality is a word or a concept that we use frequently in everyday conversation. We may say, for example, that Debbie has a vivacious personality, or that Pat has an intense and domineering personality, or that Dick has no personality. And although I feel that most of us could probably identify those aspects of behavior that contribute to overall personality, I suspect that we'd have a great deal of difficulty in coming up with a very good working definition of personality. Now, of course, the problem of defining personality has been much greater for psychologists and for personality theorists than it has been for you or I. And I rather suspect that there are, in fact, more definitions of personality than there are personality theorists. Rather than giving you just one definition of personality, I thought instead I'd read you 2 or 3 definitions of personality so that you could get the flavor of how this term has been treated in scientific psychology. Let me begin with what is perhaps one of the earliest and certainly one of the most influential definitions of personality, one by Allport from the middle 1930s. According to Allport, quote, "Personality is the dynamic organization within the individual of those psychophysical systems which determine his unique adjustment to his environment." Or again, personality is the dynamic organization of traits within the self that determine the individual's unique way of playing his social role. And one more. Personality is the sum total of the ways in which an individual characteristically reacts to and interacts with others. Well, I think you can get the general idea of what personality means. Underlying all of these definitions of personality is the notion that the individual tends to behave consistently from situation to situation, and to act in a similar manner from time to time and from situation to situation. This consistency, this underlying consistency, however we describe it, is personality. Personality theorists are essentially concerned with 3 basic issues. First, what is personality? Secondly, how is personality, whatever it consists of, structured or put together? And thirdly, how does personality develop? How do we get to have the personality that we have? Now, there are many different answers, or sorts of answers to that question, and let's now consider several different types of personality theory. The first type I'd like to consider are trait theories. As their name implies, trait theories view personality as a collection of traits or characteristics. These traits can conveniently be described in terms of adjectives or adjective pairs. For example, aggressive or passive, trusting or suspicious, optimistic or pessimistic. The central problems for trait theories are first to decide which set of traits can most readily describe personality, and secondly, to devise ways of measuring or assessing the extent to which an individual possesses these traits. Trait theories typically do not spend a great deal of time considering how an individual comes to get the traits that he has, or how the traits that make up personality are structured or put together. The primary focus of trait theories is on the development of tests for measuring the extent to which an individual possesses a given set of traits. And we'll talk a bit more about personality tests in a couple of minutes. A second sort of approach to personality is taken by learning theories. Learning theories consider that personality consists of a set of habits or modes of behavior, learned modes of behavior, or a pattern of responses to particular stimuli. According to these theories, ways of dealing with situations and with people which are followed by reinforcement will be learned and repeated in similar situations. The reinforcement involved in this learning is typically social in nature, praise or approval, love or esteem. Many of the learning processes which we discussed last semester, for example, generalization, discrimination, higher order conditioning, and so on, are considered to be of considerable importance in the development of personality. Learning theories typically focus on the way in which personality develops, and they generally have relatively little to say about the way personality is structured and put together. There is a third set of theories which are somewhat more difficult to characterize, but which we will refer to as psychodynamic theories. These are the sorts of theories on which we will be spending most of our time. Psychodynamic theories, which include those of Freud and of Jung, among many others, view the development of personality as the result of the action and the interaction of internal cognitive processes and structures, such as, for example, the self, or the ego, or the collective unconscious. Psychodynamic theories, like learning theories, also tend to emphasize the development of personality, although many of them do have a great deal to say about the way in which personality is structured or put together. This short list of personality theories is not really the only way in which we could describe the different sorts of theories, nor does it include all the kinds of theories that there are. For example, there are what we might call eclectic theories, that is, theories which borrow terms from various places. They might contain terms which are appropriate to psychodynamic theories. They may contain some notions about learning. They may contain some notions about traits, and so on. The importance of presenting this list of theories, of ways of construing personality, is simply to indicate that that is a problem. That is, deciding what personality is a difficult problem, and that there are many different ways of approaching the task. Now, if we wish to study personality in general, or to understand the personality of an individual in particular, we must have ways of assessing or describing or measuring this personality. And what I'd like to do now, before we go on to any discussion of specific personality theories, is to describe some of the ways that have been devised for assessing and measuring personality. Personality tests as a whole can be broken down into two broad categories: objective tests and projective tests. Objective tests typically restrict the number of alternatives or choices which the subject has in taking the test. More importantly, however, objective tests provide for the standardization of administration, of recording, and of scoring tests. Now, some of these tests are fairly simple. Many, for example, involve little more than having the subject choose which, from a long series of adjectives, are those which best describe his personality, or deciding to what extent he possesses or does not possess a certain trait or characteristic. Now, of course, tests of this sort are of particular interest and of special relevance to those who take a trait view or approach to personality. There are, however, other objective tests which are much more sophisticated and much more complicated. An example of this sort is the Minnesota Multiphasic Personality Inventory, or MMPI. Now, on the MMPI, the subject is asked to say true, false, or can't say to a series of 550 statements. Well, statements like the following: I have a good appetite. Once in a while, I put off until tomorrow what I should have done today. I like to read newspaper articles on crime. I do not always tell the truth. Much of the time, I feel as though I have done something wrong or evil. My soul sometimes leaves my body. There are people who are trying to steal my thoughts and ideas. Now, each of these questions belongs on a particular test scale, of which there are 10 basic scales. And these are, don't take these down, hypochondria, depression, hysteria, psychopathy, masculinity, femininity, paranoia, psychasthenia, schizophrenia, mania, and social introversion. And there are also 2 or 3 scales which are designed to detect lying, or an attempt to make the subject appear particularly good. Faking good, it's called. Now, the subject gets a score on each of these scales based on his answers to the questions on that scale. The result is a profile score, which looks something like this. On the vertical axis is plotted the possible scores of the subject. On the bottom, along the horizontal axis, are plotted the various scales. In this slide, they are not labeled with the names that I gave them. They are simply numbered. The separate scales that you see on the left, the 2 or 3 of them, are those which are designed to detect lying. And the remainder of the scales on the right are the basic scales that I listed to you. Now, you may be able to see 2 horizontal lines running through the center of this slide. Those are the ranges of scores which are typical for the normal population. As you can imagine, this subject, therefore, is not a normal subject. The dark line you see here connects the scores that the subject achieved on each of the scales of the test. The high points on for this particular subject are on the depression scale and on the schizophrenia scale. This is an MMPI profile from a schizophrenic patient. Now, once the profile has been generated, it can be analyzed by itself, and more importantly, it can be compared with the profiles which are generated by other populations of subjects. For example, it can be compared with the profiles which are typically generated by normal individuals, or it can be compared with the profiles generated by schizophrenics, psychotics, psychopaths, and so on. Now, the manner in which the MMPI was developed is particularly interesting. What was done was that initially a large number of questions, or statements rather, several thousand were constructed, and they were then administered to a number of groups of subjects. They were administered, for example, to a group of normal subjects, to a group of schizophrenics, to a group of paranoids, and so on and so on. And the items that were chosen for each scale on the test were those which best discriminated between a normal population and a population which possessed the characteristic named by the scale. So, for example, the schizophrenia scale on the MMPI consists of those questions which were most likely to be answered differently by schizophrenics and by normals. Likewise, the paranoia scale consists of those questions which were most likely to be answered differently by paranoids and by normals. The MMPI is one of our most important objective tests, and it is widely used not only as a diagnostic tool, but also, and perhaps unfortunately, it is used to screen applicants for jobs in government and industry. In general, then, the most important features of objective tests are that their scoring and application are standardized, and that they produce results which are not biased by the prejudices, the theoretical prejudices or subjective biases of the examiner. Now, projective tests, on the other hand, allow the subject to respond in a relatively unrestricted manner to stimuli, usually visual, which are relatively ambiguous or unstructured. And the interpretation of the subject's responses is left up to the examiner. Now, perhaps the most familiar of the projective tests is the Rorschach inkblot test. Now, as you know, on this test, the subject is shown a series of ink blots, similar to the ones that you see here. Some of these ink blots are in color. Some of them are in black and white. And the subject is asked to report what he or she sees. The scoring of such responses can be rather complicated and difficult. Many books have been written on the subject. But in general, the examiner will consider a number of factors, such as whether the subject uses the entire blot or only small portions of it, whether he incorporates the color information in his responses, whether he sees an active or a passive scene, whether people are involved and what they are doing, of course, whether his response is ordinary or common, or is it unusual, and whether there is any consistent pattern or common feature in the responses. Another common projective test is the thematic apperception test, or TAT. On this test, the subject is shown a series of drawings similar to those that you see here. And he is asked to describe who these people are, what they are doing, and what they are going to be doing. The scoring of such responses involves many of the same sorts of factors that I mentioned for the Rorschach inkblot test. In particular, the examiner may look to see whether there is any consistent pattern of responses. For example, do the themes chosen by the subject tend to reflect power? Do they tend to reflect dominance, and so on? These kinds of things can be used to give an indication of the subject's personality. Now, there are many, many other projective tests, but I think that these two, which are perhaps the most widely known and widely used, give you a good idea of what projective tests are all about. All of these projective tests are based on the same notion, and that is that we can discover something about an individual's personality by allowing him to project that personality or certain aspects of it on a situation, on a stimulus, which is otherwise unstructured and ambiguous. Now, these sorts of tests are of particular relevance to theorists who take a psychodynamic approach to personality. Now, there are two important concepts concerning tests, and of course personality tests as well, which I would like to discuss here before we go on, because this is really the only point in the course at which we will be discussing testing in any great detail. And these two concepts are reliability and validity. In order to be useful, a test must be both reliable and valid. A test is said to be reliable if the subject achieves approximately the same score each time he takes the test. For example, an IQ test would not be reliable if the subject scored 150 the first time he were tested, 75 the second time he were tested, and 100 or 120 the third time he were tested. We would not have a reliable estimate of IQ from this test. So reliability is providing the same measure, the same score, every single time the subject takes the test. A test is not useful if it is not reliable. A second important characteristic of tests is validity. A test is valid to the extent that it measures what it is supposed to be measuring. For example, a test of anxiety would not be valid if the scores on the test did not bear any relationship to anxiety level. Or a test of depression would be valid only if the scores on that test were correlated with the amount of depression that the subject was experiencing. So validity is measuring what you are supposed to be measuring. Now, it's important to understand that it is possible for a test to be reliable but not valid. For example, suppose that I have devised the Tricky-Dicky Athletic Abilities Test. This test consists of dividing the subject's height by the circumference of his or her upper arm. Now, I strongly suspect that this test is highly reliable. That is, it gives the very same score every single time the subject is tested. On the other hand, however, it is very unlikely that this test is valid. It's very unlikely that scores on the tricky-dicky athletic abilities test bear any relationship to athletic ability measured in some more reasonable way. So this is an example of a test which is reliable but not valid. On the other hand, it is not possible for a test to be valid but not reliable. Okay? We cannot possibly really be measuring what we are supposed to be measuring if every time we administer the test we get a different score. So a test cannot be valid but unreliable. Now, in the next lecture, we are going to discuss the earliest and the most important of the psychodynamic theories of personality, the psychoanalytic theory of Sigmund Freud. Now, it is important to understand the outlines of this theory for reasons which have nothing to do with whether or not the theory is true. And that's a question which is still very much up in the air. The theory is important because of the impact that Freud's ideas have had not only in the study of personality and abnormal psychology, but also on many aspects of our culture, including art, literature, and history. For example, there are many, many books, many, many publications which are devoted to the psychoanalytic interpretations of literature. I recall in my sophomore English class, for example, as an undergraduate, I had a visiting professor whose entire life had been spent editing a magazine which discussed literature in psychoanalytic terms. I remember one very memorable week during which we discussed the question, did Oedipus have an Oedipus complex? I thought this was a ridiculous notion, and I spent the entire week reading a motorcycle parts catalog in the back of the class, after I had told him that I thought the whole idea was ridiculous. In the area of history, for example, we find psychohistory. In this discipline, what people do is go back and take the life of a very famous or important individual and analyze it in psychoanalytic terms. He did what he did because of conflicts with his mother, lust for his mother, so on and so on and so on. So Freud has had a tremendous impact on many areas of our culture. Now, the terms which Freud introduced or popularized have found their way into our everyday vocabulary. Terms like ego, id, superego, libido, penis envy, castration anxiety, birth trauma, the unconscious, and many, many, many more. Our view of man, of ourselves, is so pervasively influenced by Freud's ideas that it is almost impossible for us to realize just how great that influence is. Freud's theories involved a very drastic change in our view of man's position in the world. Freud's ideas can be considered the most recent of a series of disruptions in man's view of his position in the universe. The first disruption was the heliocentric theory, which said that man and the place in which he lived was not at the center of the universe. This theory was very distressing, but nevertheless it left man in a very special and privileged position with respect to the rest of life. He was completely and totally distinct from animals, and he shared many of the characteristics of the angels. Okay? Now, the second and most important, perhaps, blow to man's collective ego, if you like, was Darwin's theory of evolution. Now, Darwin placed man very, very firmly in the animal kingdom. Man became only one of a number of species which had developed from equally humble beginnings as single-celled organisms. We thus represented only the end of a continuum in terms of habits, instincts, and abilities. And indeed, according to Darwin, we shared many of these instincts and habits with the lower animals. Now, Darwin influenced Freud a great deal, as of course he did much of psychology. For example, the field of animal learning, in particularly instrumental conditioning, developed in part as the result of an attempt to scale the intelligence of animals. One of Thorndike's early books, for example, was entitled Animal Intelligence. Our willingness to generalize from animal research to human behavior is based in part on the notion that evolution is a continuous process, and that The abilities and capacities possessed by animals in many cases differ in quantity rather than in quality. Now, Freud's contribution to this change in our view of our position in the grand scheme of things and of our nature was to place control over our behavior in these primitive, instinctual, unconscious, barely controllable urges or instincts, and especially in sexual urges. We are driven, he said, by unconscious, uncontrollable passions, not by reason or by will or by the search for truth, beauty, wisdom, and so on. Now, the reaction to Freud's theories was, of course, predictably strong and predictably negative. Young Victorian women who were forbidden from even mentioning his name were titillated, shocked, and appalled by what they read in the privacy of their bedrooms or whatnot. Despite the consternation which Freud's ideas caused among polite Victorian society, an argument can be made, and many believe, that it was, in large measure, the very nature of that society which determined much of Freud's theory. Where did Freud get his ideas? Well, Freud was a physician, and he had been trained in neurology and brain anatomy. He became interested in psychiatry, and particularly in hysteria, a disorder in which the patient, usually female, suffers paralysis or loss of feeling for no apparent physiological reason. At the time, people believed that there must have been some sort of physical damage in these people. That is, if the problem was not in the nerves and the musculature of the leg or hand, it must be somewhere in the brain. Under the influence of Charcot in France and Breuer in Germany, Freud became convinced that hysteria had psychological rather than physiological causes, and that it could be cured by having the patient recall, either under hypnosis or by the method of free association, forgotten or repressed incidents or events from the unconscious, events which Freud believed were the cause of the symptoms which the patient showed. Now, in using these methods to treat female hysterics and others, Freud discovered that many of the forgotten events and memories which were responsible for these symptoms were sexual in nature and involved sexual conflict. And from these observations, these clinical observations, came Freud's theory, in which the repression of sexual impulses plays such a very, very large role. Now, many later theorists argued against Freud's emphasis on the role of sexual drives in both abnormal and normal behavior. But it is perhaps understandable that this should be the case given the nature of the times and the culture in which Freud lived and worked. The Victorian era in Vienna, as in many other places, was a time of relative prudery and repression with respect to sexuality, and especially with respect to female sexuality. Since Freud's patients were largely Victorian females, therefore, it is not very surprising that the conflict over sexuality played such a large role in their lives, both consciously and unconsciously. It's questionable whether, if Freud were alive today, he would draw the same conclusions about the importance of sexuality in personality development. Well, regardless of whether Freud would create the same theory were he alive today, and regardless of whether or not we believe that Freud's theory is true, there is no doubt that the impact of his ideas has been tremendous. And next time, we'll consider just what some of those ideas are.
Characteristic that is